What are the specific steps that my generation can take to help raise the Republican Party back up in this state?
Great question, Nathan. And I was on talk radio on Sunday and Monday before the election confidently predicting that we would carry Colorado for Trump and then make Trump president. And at least the second half of my bold and somewhat bluffing prediction came true. And we made it a lot closer than it was for Obama in 2012 and 2008. The margin was much narrower, 2% and change. Michael Bennet had much more of a scare from underfinanced, unknown Republican Senate challenger, Darrell Glenn. I think that this election shows demography is not destiny. Striking that after all of the furor about Trump's politically incorrect remarks about this group and that group, he did marginally better with blacks, Hispanics, and Asians than Romney did. And yet, at the same time, he did better with evangelicals than Romney or George W. Bush ever did. But just stick with the notion that Colorado, like lots of other states, is on its way to becoming minority majority in not very long. When your generation of 1776 scholars is out there in the world putting your degree to work in public service or business or education or medicine or wherever you're going to be, we'll be a majority-minority state. But the appeal of putting people in charge of their own destiny, giving them back the dignity of work, helping them know that those Latinos who obeyed the rules to attain U.S. permanent residency and then maybe citizenship aren't going to be swamped by people who not only broke the rules, but in some cases break the law and endanger us all. The possibility exists that the Republican message, which is not the classic Reagan-Armstrong message under Donald Trump, no doubt about that, but it can be made appealing to a broad majority. If Michigan could go or almost go, Minnesota almost go, Pennsylvania could go for Trump, lots of things are going to start surprising people. And his performance, I think, is going to surprise a lot of people who don't think that there's anybody except the street-fighting brawler who punches back hard when he's challenged inside that suit. You're going to find a different Donald Trump who is a master persuader and man, as we said, who understands the art of the deal. He's going to surprise a lot of people, and I still think there's a bright future for Colorado getting out of the purple, not going blue, getting back towards the red. What else? Brandon Yates.
Thank you very much, John. I read your book, I believe it was over this summer, Responsibility Reborn, and one thing that struck me was the leaders that you analyzed and how they dealt with times of division and conflict, men like Moses, Abraham Lincoln, and Reagan. And I was curious if there was one man or one story that, in your mind, would be very applicable to us today as we're trying to figure out how do we heal this division, how do we show leadership, and like you just said, bring this message not so it's just inside a party, but becomes, once again, the American message. Thank you.
We could be here all night with that one, Brandon, but to me, the greatest American who ever lived was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln understood the founding principles, all created equal, and that our rights and liberties are endowed upon us from God, not granted us by government, and that equality must be honored even at the sacrifice of immense blood and treasure, and he kind of sensed it was cost him his own life, and it did. The heroism of Lincoln is going to burn bright in history when, as much as we love Bill Armstrong, it won't be easy to find anything out about Bill Armstrong. But there's a kinship between the two men's unswerving purpose and their self-sacrificing devotion to something bigger than themselves. And if that is what a CCU education is giving you and Nathan and each of the students that receive the certificate this evening, that you take this 1776 motif seriously into your bones, that it's bigger than we are trustees of something, we are stewards of something. Think of all the parables of Jesus that pivot around somebody that is a steward. They have been put in a trust. Will they live up to the trust? Will they fall asleep? Will they quarrel among themselves? Will they start cheating when the master's back is turned? Will they forget what the mission was? Will they get paralyzed with fear and bury their talent in the ground instead of investing it and multiplying it? Stewardship. If my friend Professor Kevin Miller was here, he could give a whole wonderful dissertation on that. Some of you have heard him do that in the business school. Good stewards. That's what Bill Armstrong was. That's what Abraham Lincoln was. That's what each of us can be. Yes, Chairman Steve House. You know, this man did so much to help Colorado almost carry for Trump. Republican state chairman. You know that, by the way, students, if you haven't thought about this, just because, Nathan Garner, we lost Colorado, I mentioned that it's a team effort, a team choice that the people made to put Republicans in power in the White House and keep them in power in the House and Senate and give us the appointive power over the judicial branch. It's also a team effort among the states. And the fact that somebody for the Broncos runs a terrific fake and gets creamed by two defenders, they didn't have the ball, but those two defenders were pulled away from the hole where the ball carrier could go through. And so every race matters. Colorado's effort mattered a lot by tying up resources and making Hillary and Bill and their celebrity pals come in here, and maybe they made the difference in Pennsylvania or North Carolina that put the winning combination together. Chairman House.
So taking advantage of your historical knowledge, back when the country was founded, John, we had a very homogeneous working group of people who lived here. And it's got more complex from agrarian to industrial to information age. Would you consider, because this is a conversation going on now, would you consider the idea that a state like Colorado should distribute its electoral votes by congressional district to be more representative of the people like Maine does or like Nebraska has the option to do with one congressional district? Do you think that will ever happen, or is it a good idea?
Well, if you've ever been to Maine, you know they're a little odd up there down east. Who else would tell me to come north to visit their state and tell me that I was going down east? I don't get it at all. I don't need to comment on Nebraska. That's kind of a punchline in and of itself, right? But seriously, Mr. Chairman, I think there is merit in the distribution by congressional districts, even because of what does it do? It simply carries one step further the geographic diversification and the checks and balances that were designed in the Electoral College itself. And I don't remember the exact populations or the geographic areas of some of the original colonies that became the 13 states, but I do know this fact. You have to learn it if you ever want to get votes in Weld County, Colorado, which I had to at one time. Weld County, Colorado itself is bigger than the state of Connecticut. So we've got congressional districts, I'm trying to say, bigger geographically than some states in land area and much larger in population. Golly, another whole subject is 435 congressional districts, and how many more constituents every congressman now has, 750,000, than they had when that number was nailed in place in about 1910. Long story short, I think it's well worth considering, because the more checks and balances we can have against pure, raw, brutal majoritarianism, the better we're going to govern this increasingly diverse country of ours.
We have another one over here.
President Andrews, I have two questions for you. Carl Hoops. At one point, I understand that Senator Armstrong came pretty close to getting in the White House himself, that he was being seriously considered as a vice presidential running mate. If you can add any details about that story, I'd love to hear. And secondarily, since you did work in the White House, would you be able to enlighten us a little bit as to how critical this process is for the next 8 weeks of filling in those 4,000 plus appointments, and what a big effect that's going to have on what kind of an administration President-elect Trump actually carries out?
Well, first, as to Bill Armstrong and the presidency, unless there was another occasion on the 4-year roll of Americans choosing a president that I'm not aware of, it was '88. He was in his second term in the U.S. Senate, Reagan was term limited. Everybody knew that his Vice President, George Bush, would be one of the favorites for the nomination, but it was a hotly contested nomination nonetheless. And Armstrong was being courted by many constitutional conservatives and the Christian right to put in his name for the White House, not for VP, but to run for president. And again, with that wonderful sense of humor of his, he would say, why, at one point I broke 1% in the polls. But there have been lots of presidents that were at 1% in the polls and came surging in to contention. He decided, I think, because he loved business and free enterprise, as I alluded to, I think also he weighed overall the toll that politics and serving in Washington, commuting from Denver, was taking upon his family. And if we were making a longer list than the 5 keys to greatness, his devotion to family as a dad and grandfather, taking care of his own elderly parents in their latter years here in Denver, mattered hugely to Bill. And I think that took him out of the 88 contention. That's the only year that I know of. As far as the coming weeks to choose the White House staff and cabinet appointments and sub-cabinet appointments, you're right, it's about 4,000 jobs. Absolutely critical, and we should be paying attention. We should chase down the best sources that we can of who is under consideration and find ways to make our voices heard. And one of the best ways would be through any senator or congressman whose contact information you have, because that will channel better to the White House, the transition team, than simply a relative of mine tried writing personally to some public Donald Trump email the other day, and I had to tell her, I'm afraid nobody's ever going to read this. But take it in through senators and congressmen, and be a voice on talk radio, and social media has democratized American self-government. Do all of those things. It matters immensely who's in his cabinet and who is in those key appointments. Did you hear that a climate skeptic named Myron E. Bell from the Center for Competitive Enterprise is the leader of the EPA transition team, and so the global warming worship is going to get taken down a peg? Did you hear that Michelle Rhee, the celebrated education reformer in D.C., who was run off by the unions as being D.C. school superintendent, maybe education secretary? I see the guy about to give me the hook as having administered the hook on many occasions. I know what it's like. One more question. Well, in honor of a World War II vet and a dear, dear friend of Centennial Institute and of mine personally, Tom Graham, is that your hand that I see? Greatest generation, World War II veteran, Tom Graham. Okay. All right. The man is insufferable enough. Now look what you went and did.
That's embarrassing. My main battles was at the Sandbar in Washington, D.C. But my question is, I noticed that the graduates of public schools today they have a different knowledge than when I graduated. And that was back in 41. And I talked to them, and they don't seem to have a basic knowledge of economics or of history. And I think that's why we got an Obama in the first place, and why people would be interested at all in Bernie Sanders. But I can't trace where this started, where this all came from.
It started with a progressive, Marxist-leaning education professor and philosopher named John Dewey at the Columbia Teachers College in the 1920s. He was going to take progressivism into the American elementary, high school classrooms, and succeeded beyond his wildest dreams with fundamental tenets such as everybody has their own truth. There is no absolute morality. There is no absolute truth. You kind of make it up as you go along. Nobody really lives that way. No one would get on an aircraft or go into an operating room that was run on those principles, and yet people seem to think we can govern ourselves that way. And then it got a lot worse when teachers got unionized, and that started too in New York City. And as teachers have unionized, schools have become like factories, and they're run for the benefit of their employees more than for the benefit of the kids in the classrooms. And it is an absolute scandal, and it's one of the many things that we hope President Trump and Speaker Ryan and Leader McConnell and people on the team of the good guys will start to change. You are all hereby drafted. I'm not taking you as volunteers. You are draftees. You are conscripts. You are not allowed to drop out of the Bill Armstrong conspiracy to live with greatness one at a time and thereby make America great again. I'll be at the back table there if I can displace President Sweeting from the chair. Happy to have you all take home one or several of the Keys to Greatness bookmarks, and for a good book to put those bookmarks in. Responsibility Reborn and Backbone, Colorado, USA. Our hero, Bill Armstrong, lived with immense personal responsibility. He knew it's the price of freedom. He lived with backbone. He knew what he stood for, and he didn't crumble when it got tough. If all of us live that way, it will translate upward to Washington, D.C., and we can get some responsibility and some backbone, some spine back into Washington, D.C., and make this country great again. Thank you all. Wonderful to be with you this evening.